I was driving alone that night, just trying to get home. The road stretched endlessly ahead, barely lit by the occasional street lamp, but for the most part it was just my headlights cutting through the darkness. The kind of road that makes you feel isolated, even if you know civilization isn't that far away. The silence was thick, broken only by the steady hum of my tires against the pavement. I had been on the road for a while, zoning in and out, my mind shifting between the music on the radio and random thoughts. I wasn't tired, but that kind of drive, the ones where nothing really happens, makes you feel like you're in some kind of trance. The road signs blurred past, and I barely saw another car. Then, out of nowhere, something caught the glow of my headlights. A bunch of shattered glass bottles scattered across the asphalt. My stomach dropped. It wasn't just a couple of bottles. It was enough to ruin my tires if I drove over them. My foot slammed the brake instinctively, and the car jolted to a stop just in time. For a few seconds, I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, my heart pounding from the sudden stop. Something felt off. The placement of the bottles wasn't random. It looked deliberate, almost like someone had dumped them there on purpose. My first thought was that it could have been a prank, maybe some reckless kids messing around. But something about it didn't sit right. That's when I noticed movement from the side of the road. At first, it was just a shift in the shadows, barely noticeable. But as I focused, I realized there were figures emerging from the dark, 2 of them. They had been waiting in the overgrown grass just beyond the road. My pulse skyrocketed. One of them had something in his hand, a long object, maybe a pipe, maybe a bat. I couldn't tell, but I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't random. This was a setup. Instinct kicked in before logic. My hand shot to the door locks, securing them in place. My mind raced through options: speed forward and risk shredding my tires, or stay put and hope they weren't planning something worse. But waiting wasn't an option. I threw the car into reverse. The second I slammed the car into reverse, my foot hit the gas, and the tires screeched against the pavement. The engine roared as I sped backward, my hands gripping the wheel so tight that my knuckles turned white. The 2 figures reacted instantly. They broke into a sprint toward my car, their dark silhouettes moving fast in the dim light. I caught a clearer glimpse of them as they stepped fully into the beam of my taillights. They weren't just random drifters or hitchhikers. Their movements were purposeful, aggressive. And that object, whatever it was now raised in one of their hands. Adrenaline took over. I didn't even bother looking behind me. I just kept reversing, trusting my instincts to keep me on the road. The men kept chasing, their footsteps growing louder before finally starting to fade as I picked up speed. They couldn't keep up. My heart was hammering against my ribs. My mind was racing with 100 different thoughts. If I had hesitated for even a second longer, if I had been just a little slower, they would have reached my car. And then what? The road behind me curved and I had to slow down for a second to realign. That's when I stole a quick glance back, nothing but darkness stretching behind me. The men were gone. I didn't know if they had given up or if they were hiding in the shadows, but I wasn't about to stop and find out. I shifted into drive and floored it. The road felt endless as I sped away, checking my mirrors every few seconds, half expecting to see headlights appearing behind me. But the highway remained empty. Just me and the night. I needed to report this. Whatever had just happened wasn't some random coincidence. Someone had put those bottles there for a reason. Then, up ahead, I spotted a road sign, a small blue marker with white letters. Police station, 5 miles. I didn't hesitate. The drive to the police station felt longer than it should have. My hands were still trembling on the wheel, my mind running in circles, replaying everything that had just happened. Every shadow on the side of the road made me uneasy. Every dark turn felt like another setup. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. As I approached the small town, the dim glow of streetlights finally broke the suffocating darkness. The streets were mostly empty, a few parked cars lining the quiet roads. The police station wasn't anything impressive, just a simple brick building with a few squad cars parked outside. But at that moment, it felt like the safest place in the world. I pulled into the lot and took a deep breath, trying to calm myself before stepping out of the car. My legs felt shaky, like they hadn't caught up with the fact that I was no longer in immediate danger. Inside, the station was quiet. The kind of quiet that made it clear nothing big ever happened in a town like this. The officer at the front desk barely looked up at first, probably assuming I was there for something minor, but as soon as I started explaining what had happened, his expression changed. I laid it all out. The bottles in the road, the figures in the dark, the way they ran toward my car with something in their hands. I was expecting a reaction, maybe surprise, maybe concern. Instead, the officer just exchanged a glance with another cop sitting nearby. It was subtle, but I caught it. A quick look, like they had heard this before. And then, finally, one of them spoke. "This happens more than you'd think." The words hit me harder than I expected. The way the officer said it, so casual, almost rehearsed, sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't just some weird one-time encounter. It was something that had happened before, probably more times than they cared to admit. I pressed for details, asking if they had caught anyone doing this before, if there were reports of other people nearly getting ambushed on that stretch of road. But the cop just shrugged, as if it wasn't worth looking into. He took down my statement, but there was no urgency, no real concern. It felt like I was just another entry in a long list of similar reports that would go nowhere. That realization made my stomach turn. I asked if it was a known gang or some kind of criminal setup, but the officer didn't give me a straight answer. He just told me to be careful, to avoid driving alone on back roads at night, and to check my surroundings if I ever saw debris on the road again. Then, as if to close the conversation, he handed me back my ID and thanked me for coming in. That was it. Walking out of that station, I felt a strange mix of relief and unease. I had escaped whatever was supposed to happen that night, but there was no sense of closure. No explanation, no reassurance that those guys would ever be caught. I got back in my car and sat there for a long time, staring at my own reflection in the rearview mirror. The night felt heavier now, like I had brushed up against something dark and unseen, something that had almost pulled me under. Eventually I started the engine and drove off. Even now I think about that night, about what could have happened if I had hesitated just a little longer, if I hadn't reacted fast enough, about how many other people had gone through the same thing, and about how many hadn't been so lucky. One thing's for sure, I'll never ignore my instincts again, and I'll never trust an empty road at night. It happened a few years ago when I was working night shifts as a janitor in Seattle. Cleaning offices at odd hours wasn't exactly a dream job, but it paid the bills. To make some extra cash, I had signed up for a rideshare app and would take a few passengers after work before heading home. That night had been long, and I was exhausted. I had already told myself that the next ride would be my last one. Just as I was about to turn off the app, a request popped up from a neighborhood a little outside the city. It wasn't an area I usually drove to, but I figured one more ride wouldn't hurt. When I arrived at the location, I spotted the passenger standing on the corner. He was wearing loose clothing and a baseball cap pulled down low over his face. Something about him made me uneasy. Maybe it was the way he stood there still, not even looking at his phone. But I ignored the feeling and unlocked the doors. He got in without a word and gave me a vague destination. He just wanted to go somewhere quiet. That alone was unsettling. Most people had a clear destination in mind. I tried not to think too much about it and started driving. The car was silent except for the sound of the road beneath the tires. Every so often I glanced at him in the rearview mirror. He wasn't looking out the window like most passengers. Instead, he kept one hand in his jacket pocket, fidgeting with something. It didn't take long for the uneasiness to turn into full-blown tension. Something about the way he kept moving his hand inside his pocket made my stomach tighten. Was he just playing with his phone, holding his wallet? Or was it something else? My mind started racing through possibilities, and none of them were good. Then, he broke the silence with a question. He asked if I had ever picked up dangerous passengers. It was such an odd thing to ask. Most people either made small talk or stayed quiet, but this felt different. Before I could think of an answer, he followed it up with another question, whether I carried a weapon. That was when the fear started to settle deep in my chest. I forced myself to stay calm, but my mind was screaming at me that something was wrong. Then came the final question, the one that nearly made my hands shake on the wheel. He asked what I would do if someone tried to rob me right then and there. The weight of his question lingered in the air. I kept my eyes on the road, pretending not to be affected, but inside, I felt my pulse quicken. Everything about the situation felt wrong. The way he asked those questions wasn't casual. He was testing me, seeing how I would react. I knew I had to think fast. If I showed any sign of fear, it might make things worse. If I acted too indifferent, it might encourage him to take whatever next step he had in mind. So, I kept my voice steady and responded as if I had heard stranger things before. I made it seem like I was just another tired driver, uninterested in conversation. But inside, I was already planning my next move. There was no way I was going to take him anywhere secluded. I needed to get us somewhere public, somewhere with people around. I glanced at my phone's GPS and casually adjusted the route, taking us toward a well-lit area with more traffic. If he noticed the change, he didn't say anything. The drive stretched on, the tension growing with every passing minute. My hands gripped the wheel tightly as I tried to act natural. He kept shifting in his seat, still fidgeting inside his pocket. My mind was screaming at me to get out of this situation, but I couldn't just stop in the middle of nowhere. That was when I saw it, a police car parked near a traffic light up ahead. It was my chance. I slowed down slightly, keeping my movements casual. Then I acted as if something was wrong with the car. I mumbled about an engine issue, hoping he would believe it. When we reached the red light, I pulled over near the police car, making it look like I was just checking something on the dashboard. I unlocked the doors. If he wanted to make a move, this was the moment. But he hesitated. I kept my hands steady, acting like I was just another driver dealing with a minor car problem. My heart was racing, but I knew I had to keep my movements controlled. If he sensed my fear, things could spiral fast. The doors were unlocked. I had positioned the car close enough to the police vehicle that I could make a move if I had to. The tension inside the car was suffocating. The man didn't say anything, but I could feel him watching me. I didn't dare make eye contact in the mirror. Slowly, I reached for the door handle and stepped out, keeping my posture casual. The second I was outside, I turned slightly toward the officers, trying to get their attention without making it obvious. My mind was screaming for them to look my way. Then, just as I was about to take another step, I heard the car door open behind me. The man had hesitated for a moment, but had made his decision. Instead of confronting me, he slipped out and disappeared into the darkness of the side street. I didn't chase after him. I didn't want to. The relief that washed over me was immediate, but short-lived. One of the officers finally noticed me and asked if I needed help. I forced a smile and shook my head, saying it was just a minor car issue. I wasn't sure why I lied, but at that moment, I just wanted to get out of there. Driving home that night, I kept thinking about what had almost happened. Maybe he had no bad intentions. Maybe I had overreacted. But deep down, I knew the truth. That man had been testing me, waiting for the right moment to do something. And if I hadn't acted fast, I might not have been the one telling this story. I never worked as a rideshare driver again. I had been driving alone for hours on a nearly deserted highway, the kind where the only company you have is the occasional set of headlights appearing in the rearview mirror. The night stretched out ahead, endless and quiet, just the sound of my tires on the pavement and the hum of the engine to keep me grounded. There was something oddly peaceful about it, just me, the road, and the dark sky above. But that peace didn't last long. At some point, I noticed an old truck behind me. At first, I thought nothing of it. It was just another vehicle on the road, probably headed to some distant truck stop or a late-night delivery. But as the miles passed, something about it started to feel off. Whenever I changed lanes, it followed. Whenever I took an exit to stretch my legs or grab a coffee, it reappeared minutes later, maintaining a steady distance, never overtaking me. At first, I convinced myself it was all in my head. Maybe we just happened to be going the same way. The interstate was long, and coincidences happened. But as the night wore on, I started to feel uneasy. The road had become emptier, the gas stations fewer and farther apart. Yet the truck remained. It never sped up, never slowed down, just trailed me, always within sight, like a shadow that wouldn't let go. I tried to ignore it, but the longer it stayed behind me, the harder that became. It was as if the driver knew exactly what I was thinking, matching my every move. Even when I switched highways at a major junction, taking a completely different route than before, the truck still found me. That was when I stopped believing it was just a coincidence. After what felt like an eternity of being watched, I decided to stop at a gas station. It was one of those old, lonely ones on the side of the road, the kind that looked like it hadn't changed in decades. A few flickering lights illuminated the pumps, and a small convenience store sat in the corner, its neon sign buzzing faintly in the stillness of the night. I pulled in, pretending like I wasn't scanning the mirrors, pretending like I wasn't waiting to see if the truck would follow, and then I saw it. It pulled in a few moments after me, rolling slowly across the lot before stopping on the far side, its engine still running. The headlights dimmed, but they never turned off completely. The driver didn't get out. He just sat there waiting, watching. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I forced myself to act normal, stepping out of my car and walking into the store. I grabbed a bottle of water, a bag of chips, anything to make it seem like a regular stop. The cashier barely looked up as I paid, and for a second I thought about mentioning the truck. But what would I even say? That I felt like I was being followed? That some trucker had been trailing me for hours? It sounded paranoid, even to me. Stepping back outside, I hesitated for just a moment. The truck was still there, still idling, still watching. I didn't hesitate any longer. I got back in my car, turned the key, and pulled onto the road, pretending like I wasn't looking in the mirror. But I was. And I saw exactly what I had feared. The truck followed. Again, at that point, my heart was pounding. I had been on the road for hours, and now, no matter what I did, this truck was still behind me. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that maybe the driver was just heading in the same direction. But deep down, I knew better. Something wasn't right. I tried to shake it off, but the longer it went on, the harder that became. My hands tightened around the steering wheel as I sped up, pushing my car a little harder than I normally would. The truck didn't speed up to match me, but it never disappeared from my rear view either. It just stayed there like a dark presence I couldn't escape. Minutes passed, then an hour. The highway stretched on, mostly empty except for the occasional lone car passing in the opposite direction. I kept hoping I would hit a busier stretch of road, a place with more people, more traffic, anything to make this feel less like a nightmare. But instead, the road seemed to get quieter. The gas stations and rest stops became fewer. The lights of distant towns faded away, leaving only the glow of my own headlights cutting through the night. That was when I made the decision to take a detour. There was a small road ahead that led to a tiny town I had seen on the map earlier. It wasn't my planned route, but I figured if I could get off the main highway, maybe, just maybe, I could lose whoever was in that truck. I took the turn at the last second, my tires skidding slightly on the pavement as I veered onto the smaller road. It was darker here, lined with thick trees, the only light coming from my headlights. I held my breath, waiting. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, in the distance, the glow of headlights appeared. The truck had followed. I cursed under my breath and pressed the gas pedal harder. The road was winding, unfamiliar, but I didn't care. I needed to get away. My pulse hammered as I took another sharp turn, hoping, praying that maybe this time the truck wouldn't make it through as fast as I did. But it did. No matter what I did, no matter how fast I drove, the truck was always there. And then, just when I thought I might have lost it, I rounded a bend and slammed on the brakes. My headlights illuminated something that shouldn't have been there. The truck was already waiting for me. It was parked on the side of the road, engine running, as if it had known exactly where I would be. A chill ran down my spine. This wasn't random. This wasn't a coincidence. Whoever was in that truck had been toying with me the whole time, and now I was completely alone. For a moment I just sat there, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. My brain struggled to process what I was seeing. The truck, the same truck, was already waiting for me. That shouldn't have been possible. I had taken random turns, I had sped up, I had done everything I could to lose it. And yet, somehow, it had gotten ahead of me. Panic surged through my chest. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. Without thinking, I threw the car into reverse, my tires screeching against the asphalt as I turned back the way I came. I had no plan. I didn't care. I just knew I had to get away. The truck didn't move. It just sat there, its headlights cutting through the darkness. But I didn't trust it. I didn't trust any of this. I floored the gas, speeding back onto the highway, not even caring about the road signs or the turns. I just drove. My entire body was tense, my heart slamming against my ribs. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I couldn't stay out there any longer. Eventually, I saw the dim lights of a gas station in the distance. My car was running low on fuel after everything, and I had no choice but to stop. The moment I pulled in, I let out a shaky breath. There were other cars here, other people. The place wasn't crowded, but at least I wasn't alone. I parked near the entrance and walked inside, my legs still trembling. The clerk behind the counter barely looked up as I grabbed a bottle of water and some snacks. I didn't realize how thirsty I was until I took a sip. My throat felt like sandpaper. After a few minutes, I decided to tell the clerk about the truck. It sounded insane, even as I said it. Some guy following me all night, appearing in places he shouldn't have been able to. It sounded like a bad horror story. But the moment the words left my mouth, the clerk's expression changed. He stopped what he was doing and looked at me, his face unreadable. Then, in the most casual tone, he said something that sent ice through my veins. "If a truck like that followed you, you're lucky to be here. That happens a lot around here. Some of those drivers pick up strangers on the road, and they're never seen again." I just stood there, my skin crawling. I didn't ask any more questions. I didn't want to know the details. I just paid for my stuff, filled up my tank, and got back on the road as fast as I could. I never saw that truck again. But to this day, I still wonder, what would have happened if I had stopped? I had just finished another long shift at work and was finally heading home. The night air felt heavy and the roads were nearly deserted, just an occasional car passing by. The drive was supposed to be uneventful, just a straight shot down the highway like every other night. But something felt off. Maybe it was just the exhaustion, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. A few minutes into the drive, I noticed a set of headlights approaching in my rearview mirror. At first, I didn't think much of it. But as the vehicle got closer, I realized it was a police car, its high beams on, making it impossible to see who was inside. I kept my speed steady, assuming it would pass me, but it didn't. It just lingered behind, matching my speed exactly. I started to feel uneasy. Normally, if a cop wanted to stop someone, they'd either flash their lights immediately or just pass if there was no reason to pull them over. But this one stayed right behind me, making my skin crawl. Minutes passed, and then finally the red and blue lights flashed. I sighed, trying to shake the growing sense of dread. I pulled over to the shoulder, watching the patrol car slow down and stop behind me. I had been through routine traffic stops before, but something about this didn't feel right. The car had no visible markings, no numbers, nothing official. The door opened, and a man stepped out. My heart rate picked up as I noticed something strange. He wasn't wearing a full uniform. Just dark pants and a black t-shirt. No badge, no radio, no name tag. He started walking toward my car, moving too slowly, almost like he was stalling. Then, as he got closer, I noticed his hand was in his pocket. He wasn't holding a flashlight or a ticket book. It looked like he was gripping something. And then, instead of asking for my license or registration, he asked something that sent a chill down my spine. If I was alone. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, but my mind was racing. Something was seriously wrong. No real cop would ask that as their first question. The way he stood there, his hand still buried in his pocket, made my stomach twist with unease. I kept my expression neutral, acting as if I wasn't bothered, but inside, my instincts were screaming at me to be careful. I stole a quick glance at the patrol car in my side mirror. That's when I noticed another red flag. It had no license plate, not even a temporary tag. Every part of me wanted to just drive away, but I knew that could escalate the situation. Instead, I reached for my phone, keeping my movements slow and deliberate. My hands were shaking slightly as I unlocked the screen. I didn't know what this guy's intentions were, but I wasn't about to take any chances. Thinking quickly, I held the phone up and acted like I was making a call. My voice came out steady, despite the fear crawling up my spine. I pretended I was talking to someone, making it sound like I was already in contact with another officer. I even paused as if waiting for a response before saying I was about to hand over my documents. The moment those words left my mouth, everything changed. The man froze. He didn't even try to act normal or continue the conversation. He just stood there for a second, his entire posture stiffening. Then, without a word, he turned on his heel and walked back to the patrol car. My pulse pounded in my ears as I watched him slide into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, and in a matter of seconds he was gone, speeding off into the dark highway. I sat there, gripping the wheel, trying to process what had just happened. For a long time, I didn't move. The highway was silent again, like nothing had ever happened. But I knew better. That wasn't just some random misunderstanding. That was someone pretending to be a cop, someone who had a reason for stopping me. And I had no doubt that if I hadn't played it smart, the night could have ended very differently. I sat there for a long time, gripping the steering wheel, trying to convince myself that I hadn't just avoided something terrible. My chest felt tight, my thoughts racing through every possibility. Who was that man? What would have happened if I had just handed over my documents like I normally would? The empty highway stretched out ahead of me, the night swallowing the last flicker of red taillights from the fake patrol car. A deep, unsettling feeling settled in my gut. I forced myself to breathe, to focus, but my hands still felt clammy against the steering wheel. Eventually, I pulled back onto the road, driving much slower than before. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting that car to reappear, but the road remained empty. The rest of the drive felt like a blur, every shadow on the roadside making my nerves spike. When I finally made it home, I locked every door behind me, double-checked the windows, and sat in the dark for a long time, staring at my phone. I knew I had to look it up. I had to find out if there had been any reports of someone impersonating an officer in the area. Maybe it was paranoia, but I needed confirmation. What I found made my blood run cold. There were no reports of any patrol cars in that area that night. No stops. No officers on duty anywhere near where I had been. The deeper I searched, the more disturbing it became. Other people had reported similar encounters, fake cops pulling them over in the middle of nowhere, asking strange questions, acting just a little too off. And in some cases, the people who stopped were never heard from again. It's been a long time since that night, but I still think about it often. Every time I see a police car in my rearview mirror, a shiver crawls up my spine. That night could have ended in 100 different ways, and I know I was lucky. I never found out who that man was or what he wanted. The authorities didn't have much to say either. No arrests, no suspects, no clear pattern. Just another unexplained encounter on a dark stretch of road. But one thing still haunts me. The way he reacted when I mentioned the call. The way he froze like he knew he had been caught. Like he had done this before. And worst of all, like he would do it again.